everyone. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Yellow Tape. Uh, I'm Nidhi, and this is Julian. Today, we have a very special guest with us who is going to talk about forensic photography and videography, and I will let Julian introduce him.
Yeah, so today we have a retired New York City detective, and he's been in the field for 25 years, and he's been in the crime scene unit for 20 years, and he's gonna talk to us about crime scene photography and all the work he has done. So yeah, but before that, guys, don't forget to like
Share,
and subscribe.
and let's get into the episode.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Yellow Tape. And we have Matthew Steiner here with us, who is a retired detective from the NYPD. And he has 24 years in the game, 19 years in the crime scene unit. And now he teaches several different classes around the country, around the world. And me and Matt met from our crime scene photography class. So he's here to impart some wisdom with us. So let's just get straight into it. So Matt, what is I guess the basics of crime scene photography?
Well, your goal as a crime scene investigator is to document, collect, and process evidence at the crime scene. And photography is probably the most important form of documentation that we have as crime scene investigators. You know, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. If you can describe to the jury the layout of the apartment, where evidence was in context of the crime scene, but instead of talking for 20 minutes to describe where the bedroom looks, you could show them several photographs to show exactly the way it looked like, where that evidence was, to show the evidence in its context. So it's a valuable tool. It's been around as long as photography's been around. There have been crime scene photographs, and it's one of these things that keeps developing and getting better. And it's something I've been passionate about for the last 25 years, which I've just retired at 25 years. So I think the CV I sent you, that Julian said 24 with 19 years. It was 20 with 25 years that I retired.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool stuff. Good stuff. I also wanted to. I usually ask this question at the end, but I figure let me ask in the beginning. Are there any times where like maybe having photographs was a hindrance? I don't know if that makes sense, but like, did any times it hurt you?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, you learn from your mistakes. You learn from other people's mistakes. If any of our budding investigators out there, whether no matter what end of the forensic spectrum you plan on jumping into, think of looking at like famous cases. Look at the wins and losses on those cases. Like what could be done better, and for crime scene investigators, I say, hey, look at the O.J. Simpson case, because that's like the game plan of what not to do at a crime scene.
Yeah.
And if you look at photographs specifically, they didn't do a great job of capturing a scene, at least from the photographs I saw. You want to be able to show the jury the scene and everything around that scene, and everything should be in focus. So not just the focus of the camera, but we talk about depth of field. Julian, you know what that is after spending a week with me, but just knowing that besides the focus of the camera, that if you change that f-stop number, the range from the foreground to the background is going to become either in focus or out of focus. And I see a lot of times in crime scene photography that you'll have the exposure correct. So it's a correct amount of lightness and darkness in the photograph, but maybe the depth of field is very low, very shallow, and you can't see beyond wherever you're actually focused. So if I look back at my old crime scene photographs when I first started back in the day, when we used film, didn't really care so much or know so much about the depth of field aspect of crime scene photography. And I just want to make sure that the photograph looks good. And it would look good because the exposure was correct. But if you tried to zoom in or make that photograph larger, anything outside that point of focus had very shallow depth of field in the beginning when I first started. Right. As I've taken courses and kind of became a student of the game, it's one of the first things that I want to prioritize is the depth of field.
That's really interesting. But actually, that brings me to another question. Like you mentioned as to how you would do photography before and now. So did the technology advancement actually help the field in getting better photos, or has it been more on the negative side?
1,000%. I mean, the only good thing about the day back in the day with film was that when you took your photographs, you didn't know what you were getting when you were pressing that shutter, and you
Yeah.
send that roll off film off, and then you'd learn from your mistakes. So I was probably more mindful writing down my settings for each photograph. And then after a while, I kind of learned photography through trial and error, where now like we get instant results. And so I guess it's kind of it's both ways because now you see your problems that you have right away. So you know, oh wait, that photograph is out of focus. That photograph is too dark. It's too light. I'll take another one. Then you didn't have that. So I guess now it's a lot easier. But people now kind of use digital cameras as point and shoot. They don't really care so much about the settings. They'll put it on auto. They'll put it on program. Where when I started, there was no program or auto. I had a manual film camera where you had to dial in the aperture and the shutter speed.
So when it comes to like you mentioned that, okay, in the previous like a long time ago when you would have those films, you don't know what photo is actually being clicked, so it just depends as to how it came out. But now when you have like multiple chances to take a good photograph, what do you do of the other photographs which are like junk photographs? Are they a piece of evidence or sorry, it's a stupid question.
No, no, it's a great question. That's a great question. I say to all students that I are in my photography classes, there's a trash can icon on your camera somewhere. It's like a button that will delete the photo, make pretend it doesn't exist because you don't want to delete photographs. Good, bad, great. You know, it doesn't matter how the photo comes out. It's always evidence. And if you have a bad photograph, just take another one. And anyone that testifies for a good amount of time, what you realize is very rarely are they going to put in all your photographs. You can go to a crime scene and take 400 photographs. They're not going to sit there and put every single one into the jury because the jury's going to get bored. They will go through your photographs and have a selection of them. And if it's a bad photograph, they won't put it in. And usually the defense won't, they get the same evidence that the prosecution has. They're not going to put in your bad photographs. They understand that things happen. You know, the flash doesn't go off or you're out of focus. Something happened with the camera. But as long as you're taking a photograph and then looking at the back of the camera and making sure that you're capturing what you want to capture before you go on to your next photograph. That's the most important thing. Is always review because there's no time machine. It's like you mess up at a crime scene, you don't collect something, you don't document something. There's no way for you to go back. Very rarely is there ways that you can go back. So get it right the first time.
Now I know, obviously, it could be like every day is not sunny. I'm assuming most crime scenes are not in the daytime. So like with rain, snow, wind, whatever, like what would be the worst conditions for you trying to get photos of a crime scene?
Yeah, it's a snowstorm or it's pouring outside. It's tough. There are ways to get around that. Using a neutral density filter, that a longer exposure. Those snowflakes, those raindrops will not be captured by the lens because they'll just fall past it over time. But it just makes it more difficult because now you have to wait longer to take these photographs. Nighttime is more difficult than daytime. Daytime, we talk about the sunny 16 rule. It's just basically a rule that's in photography for, a century, as long as, since Ansel Adams or wherever that long it is, it's got to be a long time ago. Talking about just what settings you do if you're going outside and it's sunny out and you put the camera at f16, you put your shutter speed at 100. I'm sorry, 125 or 100, and then your ISO would be 100. Back in the day, the film that you would buy was 100, and you would just go out and you would get great photographs because that's the easiest type of photograph to take is during the day. But at night it gets difficult because you have less ambient light around.
Makes sense.
That
Yeah,
brings us to like the most basic question as to what is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, if you could help us describe in like the most layman terms.
Yeah, so there's this thing called the exposure triangle where there's different sides of that triangle. And one side is ISO, and that's the camera's sensitivity to light. Back in the day, it was the film sensitivity to light.
Yeah.
Now, we don't have grain of silver halide crystal in the film that was photosensitive. We have a sensor that's, you could change the sensitivity to light. So typically for crime scene photography, we want to keep that ISO on the lower end, because the higher end, the more sensitive we make that sensor to light, the more noise we're going to get. So we want to reduce noise, especially if we're going to take examination quality photographs, say like a bloody fingerprint or a shoe wear impression. We want to keep that as low as possible. So like the lowest native ISO of the camera. Aperture, that's the f-stop number that you change, that are weird numbers like 2, 2.8, 5.6, 8, 11, 22, etc. That is the amount of light coming through the lens. And as you change that number from a lower number to a higher number, that opening in the lens gets smaller. And you're letting in less light. But as you make that number larger and that opening smaller, you get greater depth of field. And that's something that whether you're in the lab or you're in a crime scene, you want to prioritize depth of field. There's a certain range that's actually suggested. You want to be between f8 and f22. There are rules that sometimes you want to break that bracketing of it, but generally in that range. If you're going to take examination quality, start even higher. Start at f11 and you can go higher from there. And then the last is shutter speed, and that's how long that shutter stays open to let light in. So during the day, the shutter speed's going to be really fast, fractions of a second, 2,000ths of a second, 4,000ths of a second, to let in less light because we have a lot of light around us. And then at night, that shutter's going to stay open for a longer period of time.
That's interesting. So when it comes to like shutter speed, have you always taken photographs at a stationary, you being stationary and taking photographs stationary, or has there been instances where you are moving, or maybe in some situations where it's like, I don't know.
So yeah, not usually. So normally, hopefully nothing is moving inside your crime scene, unless you're talking some sort of Walking Dead situation.
I know.
But if, sometimes crime scene investigators or forensic photographers are asked to take photographs of the crowd. And sometimes you could do that covertly and while you're moving. So again, knowing if I'm moving at this speed, I'm walking, am I going to get shaken? The camera is going to be a blurry photograph because my shutter speed is too slow. So that's certainly, you'd want to prioritize a faster shutter speed if you're going to take that sort of photograph.
Okay, that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. And when you say depth of field, just for like, I guess, super basics of photography, which I guess I was before I met you, you mean like literally how far back in a photo you could see? So maybe something you might be, if you have a large crime scene, you might be a big room, you're trying to take a photo of something that's 5 feet in front of you. And if you increase your depth of field, which would be decreasing your f-stop, you would be seeing further back into that vice versa?
Yeah, the number gets higher the more depth of field, but less light comes in. But I understand. Okay. You get the idea of it. Yeah, I mean, put it this way: everyone has this with them, right? And in the last couple of years, they had that portrait feature.
Yes.
And what that does is that it gives your camera a very low f-stop number. You actually could go into your settings and change that if you wanted to. And what that's doing, it's creating what they call bokeh. And that's basically kind of what's behind me now, this blur. And I'm in focus, but the background is blurry. And that's really important for portrait photography and for aesthetic, artistic photography, but not so much for forensic photography. We want to see everything. If this is not a good crime scene photograph, you don't want to see the TV or whatever's behind me over here. But for a portrait photographer, a wedding photographer, someone that's taking artistic photographs, they want this because I'm popping out of the background. It's more flattering to have a lower f-stop number. So if I had a higher f-stop number, if I was able to change the number here on the camera, you could see as that number starts to slowly increase, the background will start to come in focus. And then once I hit the highest number, probably everything from me to the end of my background will be in focus.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So when it comes to like considering all these factors, which is the shutter speed, the f number, the ISO, what are the major differences that you have to keep in mind when you do like nighttime photography versus daytime photography? If you could share it with the audience.
Yeah, sure. So once you get to a certain shutter speed that you can't hand hold, so typically textbook answer is 1/60th of a second, but in reality, it's one over whatever your focal length of your lens is. So if I have a 35 millimeter lens, I could hold, 40th of a second, 50th of a second, 60th of a second, or faster. Anything, faster than that number, whatever that number is on my camera as I'm dialing through my shutter speeds. At night, if you have the right f-stop number, that shutter speed is going to be below that number that you can handhold almost every single time. And it's going to be probably seconds. It could be even 30 seconds or a minute if you're in a pitch black environment. So at night, you need a tripod. If you're taking examination quality photographs of something, you need a tripod. You want to stabilize that camera so you have no shake in it, so you have a good exposure without any sort of blur from movement. But also for, say, examination quality photographs, you're going to take a series of photographs bracketing, either your shutter speed or your f-stop. Typically, you want to bracket, to get more light or less light. So it's going to be your shutter speed, but you want to have the same exact composure every single time. So that bloody fingerprint on a wall, you have sort of maybe f11, and whatever the shutter speed is, you take your first photograph. All right, maybe I want to make it a little darker, maybe put a little more contrast in there. So I would go to a faster shutter speed. Maybe I want to make it a little brighter, want more light in, I'd go to a longer shutter speed.
Okay.
I'm going off topic.
No, that's fine.
How, like, is this all that you learned was through your experiences? Like, I'm sorry, it's a little bit offbeat. I should be asking more technical questions, but did you learn it through your processes, or like, did you have to take courses to learn all this information? Because you can't do a trial and error every time on the crime scene, I presume.
Oh, yeah. So when I first started, it was, the thing I was most nervous about when I first started doing forensic work, because you could go to a crime scene and you do a bad job dusting for fingerprints. Maybe you forget to do one of the steps in your process map. You don't collect something. Most people won't know, but every single crime scene, your photographs are being looked at. If you're a big crime scene, the police commissioner, the press, the whole world could be looking at that one photograph that you took. So I wanted to make sure that I was going to take good photographs. So I practiced a bunch. I took a bunch of classes, and I still take classes. I think, even if I was to go and take a basic class, there's always something that you could pick up. Or even now, as I'm teaching it, maybe a different way to teach this to make the point more, understandable for a student. So there's always value in teaching and reading. Every time a new book comes out, I will buy it. A new forensic photography book just came out. I just ordered it on Amazon. It's just something I'm passionate about. Now, do you have to be the best forensic photographer if you're going to get into forensics? No, but it's something you should be good at. You don't have to be the best, but you want to be good at it, because no matter pretty much anywhere you are in the lab, you're going to have to take photographs, or anywhere you're certainly in the field, you're going to have to take photographs. And understanding the basics is important. But then after you master the basics, learning advanced techniques, which comes with lighting techniques, different ways, maybe different frequencies, using different equipment, maybe photographing your evidence in UV or IR. This stuff gets more complex, but more interesting as you get more into it.
So when you take all these photographs, is there any identifiers that you use when you're taking photographs? Because what we were taught in school, that if you take like a bloody fingerprint, you have like a scale to it, you have like a number, you have a case number. Like, is that usually practiced on the crime scene, or is there a different way to do it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a necessity. If you're going to take examination quality photographs, fingerprints, shoe wear impressions, maybe not so much bite marks anymore, but anything that's going to be used for analysis comparison, you need a scale there. And it's got to be, depending on your agency, it's going to probably have to be something that's been checked against a known standard. If you're ASCLID accredited, whether in your laboratory or your crime scene unit, these measuring equipment that you're going to use in a field, they're checked to a known accuracy. And that if it's ever challenged in court, after it's been analyzed, compared, and maybe someone's identified by that fingerprint, you have that documentation that, this is a scale that I used and it's been checked against this known standard, whether it's NIST certified or another organization certifies it.
Do you have standards for photography? Like we have the SWIG DAM standards for like DNA, we have SWIG FAST, we have all of those. Do you have something similar when it comes to like photography?
Sure. I'm actually on the scientific working group for digital evidence in the photography section. But there was, back in the day when it went from film to digital, there was SWIG, and that was for imaging technology. And they put out some best practices. I also work with NIST and their OSAC in the photography section. We also write best practices. So there's documentation out there for pretty much any sort of photography you want to do, whether it's at autopsy, it's fingerprint photography, it's in the lab, it's in the field. There is some sort of guidelines out there. The basic ones is, prioritize your depth of field, be within that range, and know what you're trying to get. And then, beyond that, using the lower ISO number to capture detail, to make a finer photograph with less noise. But depending on what you're talking about, there is a set of standards for that. If you're going to go photograph an autopsy, there is a set of standards out that's been written for that. If you're going to photograph examination quality for a footwear impression, there's a set of standards for that. So whatever you want to do, that's a great thing about living in the information age, is that the answers are already out there.
Yeah. So is there one photographer who would do multiple things, like also could do an autopsy photography or crime scene or stains, or like are there different professionals who just handles different fields in forensic for photography?
Yeah, it depends on your jurisdiction. So New York City, we have forensic photographers that work in the autopsy suites, and they photograph every single autopsy. And some jurisdictions, the crime scene investigator will go from the crime scene to the autopsy the next day to photograph the autopsy. Some people, they have a crime scene model where you just have a forensic photographer, where it's not like a team where me and my partner do everything, where I'll photograph, I'll do the diagram, I'll dust for fingerprints, I'll collect the evidence. Where some people have a model where there's different roles, where we have a forensic photographer, we have someone does a sketch, we have someone else that will handle the evidence, someone else that will process the evidence. And so depending on where you work, there's a different answer.
Okay. That's really nice. So it's pretty much defined as to which, I'm sorry, Julian.
No, you're good.
So I think it's pretty much defined as to where you work and which state you work for, jurisdiction you work for. Okay.
Yeah. And it's also, I know you're going to get this question at the end, but like the people out there that want to get into forensic photography, there are roles for that. Like, you just don't have to become a crime scene investigator to be a forensic photographer. You could be a forensic photographer. There are imaging labs in a lot of major police departments or state labs that have an imaging department where it's forensic photographers. Or you could be a forensic photographer working at the medical examiner. And there's just a lot of, depending on what you want to do and where you live, there are plenty of options out there for you.
Very interesting.
So earlier when you were talking about the whole aperture, shutter speed, and ISO parameters, you spoke a lot about overexposing and underexposing. Could you just explain what those are in relation? Pretty much just explain what those are.
Sure. Yeah. So I think everyone who's listening to this or watching this, you know what an overexposed or underexposed photograph when you see it, whether it's too bright or too dark. Now, sometimes in the field, we want to do that intentionally. Sometimes if we're photographing a footwear impression or a fingerprint, we want to maybe make it darker or lighter to see some sort of detail that's there, that's not at our normal or nominal exposure. Sometimes the camera gets tricked. So if I'm photographing something that is completely white or completely black, the camera doesn't know what you're photographing. So it will make that object, whether it's white or black, look gray. So you sometimes will want to intentionally under or overexpose the photograph to compensate, to make the photograph look like the way it should look like.
Gotcha.
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
So when this is the question I always asked when I was in school as well, that when as a photographer you have to have when you encounter a smaller crime scene compared to like a mass disaster, and when you have so many places to take photographs for, because you would think that every piece is an evidence. Like even for the 9/11, there's such a wide area that you don't know as to what's bones, what's bricks. So how would a photographer, a forensic photographer, handle situation like a mass disaster versus like a smaller crime scene?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're watching this and you're already in the field, prepare beforehand. Ask this question to yourself and the people you work with beforehand, because when it happens, you'll want to have a plan in place. I was working during 9/11, and it was a shock to everyone on many different levels, not just forensically, but logistically, safety wise, and just from there, it was a learning, it was certainly something we learned about. And then from that, we had drills. We had mass disaster drills where we had, everyone did their own function, whether it was like SWAT people or EMS people or fire department. And then, finally, we usually come at the end, the crime scene aspect of it, the lab aspect of it. Just prepare and, know that if it's a large scene, you may have to break that up into smaller scenes. So for the West Side terror attack, which happened 6 years ago, maybe longer ago, on the West Side in Chelsea and Manhattan, a guy drove a truck and ran over a bunch of people. That scene was a mile long. So we broke that up into 4 different scenes. And then we kind of had a similar model for our documentation, where each of those scenes, the evidence would be documented, collected, and processed by 2 people. So we had probably more than a dozen people there collecting evidence, but we had a separate team doing the laser scan. So we wound up doing like probably 30 or 40 laser scans, from a mile, from the north end of the scene down to the south end of the scene to capture it. So sometimes it's not just the one thing that you have. Say you have one laser scanner and you have that scene broken up into 5 or 6 scenes. You may have to think about that logistically, like, how if this one team needs it, and the other team has it, how would you do that? And it's just a lot of just figuring how to keep all the plates spinning. Having people in charge that can really delegate authority. I think about what are we going to need it, when we're going to need it, and then just make sure that everyone is everyone's okay, because these scenes take forever. When I first started crime scene work, a normal scene would be about 4 hours, a large scene would be 8 hours. Now an average scene is going to be 8 hours, and some of our scenes could be days. So that's another part of the equation, is thinking about this is a long-term operation. How are we going to handle it? So it's just preparing in advance and thinking on your feet as well.
Is there a number of photos that you would have to take a cap on the number of crime scene photos, or because like you can't take like thousands of photos for a smaller crime scene, like 10,000, like you would do? Is there a number to it, or is it just that a photographer depends on the crime itself?
Yeah, there's no magic number. Typically what you see is that when people are new and they first start off, they take more photographs because you don't really know, not that you know what you're doing, but just like you're overly cautious. You don't know what you really need. And then as you get more experience, you kind of know, all right, I don't need all these photographs. I could take these certain photographs, but more is better than less. So, if you take if you need 100 photographs to document that scene, you need 100 photographs. If you need 50 photographs, you need 50 photographs. Ultimately, in the end, you're the one that's got to testify to it. So, if you're being lazy and you're taking less photographs, know that sometime in the future that you're going to regret that. You're going to go to court and you're like, oh, why didn't I photograph that? Why didn't I take that note? Or why didn't I do this or that? So, trying to cut corners, not knowing which corners you can cut can often be a problem.
Yeah, that's fair. It's always better to take more than less. So is crime scene photography same as crime scene videography, or are they two different fields in itself?
Yeah, they're similar in that the video camera works on the same concept, the same exposure triangle with the video camera. The thing with videography, it's different equipment, though. The SLR cameras we have now do video. The problem is that it doesn't have the same stabilization that a typical video camera will have. There's no gimbal system unless you have one attached to that camera. So if you've ever watched a crime scene video done with a typical crime scene camera, it looks like the Blair Witch Project. Like you watch one and you never want to watch it again. But it's important, and sometimes it's a separate person that comes in and does it. So for New York City, the DA's office, they have a video unit that will go out and they'll video certain crime scenes, and then other crime scenes will video. And in some it really depends on jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions, every crime scene, if you're taking photographs, they're doing video, and that walkthrough of the scene is important because it's just another way to give perspective to the jury. Your photographs are two-dimensional, they're static, from one position, where the video is more dynamic. You're moving yourself around the scene. You're giving that walkthrough to the jury, saying, all right, you walk in the front door, you make a left, there's the kitchen, you go beyond the kitchen, there's the bedroom, there's the second bedroom, there's the bathroom. With a 5-minute video, you could show them the whole layout and they'll understand it. If you're not running through it and moving the camera around crazily.
Is it true that when you're doing the videography of the crime scene, it has to be on mute? I know it's a silly question, but
that's a great question. Yes, you should. Best practices: put a dummy plug in the mic jack so that you don't capture audio. The thing with photographs is you're looking through the lens and you could see what's there. You could tell people to get out of your way, but other than that, you can't stop people inside the crime scene or outside the crime scene from talking. So with video, anything that's on there, the audio is evidence too. If someone says something stupid, that's documented permanently. That's in evidence forever. I know about a terrible story that happened. That wasn't me, someone that I knew, that videotaped a crime scene without that plug-in. And someone said something so stupid that it wound up getting the case thrown out. So yeah, make sure it's on mute, or you put that dummy plug in if you're gonna do video, because it could be someone that's out on the other side of the yellow tape that's saying something that's going to be evidence, and that that is something the jury's going to hear. So you want to just show them the video without any sort of sound.
Yeah, that's pretty fair, because even we were taught that there was a case like a long time ago where something similar, I guess, because I studied in Pace, did my master's from there, so it was an NYPD cop who was teaching us, and he made it so specific that when you're recording a video, it has to be mute, because if you record something stupid, it's not good.
Was it with the Hells Angels?
I'm sorry, sir?
Was it a case with the Hells Angels?
I don't remember, so I don't want to say anything, but it was a case for sure that they spoke about.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense.
We're probably thinking of the same example.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, but again, let's go back to what I said. Learn from your mistakes. Learn from other people's mistakes. It's even easier if you don't look foolish.
That's so true. I'll hand the mic to you, Julian.
That's funny. That's crazy. Earlier you were talking about inclement weather conditions can affect your photos, and then you also mentioned the neutral density filter. So could you talk about how you use things like slow shutter speeds to eliminate rain and snow and moving variables from your photos if need be?
Yeah. So, I mean, we use different filters for crime scene work. Neutral density is basically like sunglasses for the lens. It just allows you to get slower shutter speeds. So, in the case of stuff moving by it, they're not captured. If your audience wants to look at a cool neutral density experiment that was done, just type in neutral density filter Grand Central Station. And what the photographer did was took a photograph during a busy part of the day, people walking through Grand Central Station. You could see everybody. The next photograph, he did a long exposure with the neutral density filter on, and you could only see people that were standing still. So the hundreds of people that are walking in front of the camera, you don't see them. They're not captured. So the same thing applies if we wanted to cut out rain or snow. You're just making a slower shutter speed so those individual drops of rain or snow don't get caught in front of the lens. Other filters that we use will be a polarizing filter, circular polarizing filter to cut out glare. We'll use filters, UV filters. The great thing about a UV filter is it protects the lens. And then we use colored filters for our alternate light source work. So if we go to a crime scene and there's, say, a sexual assault, and we're using blue light, we're going to use an orange filter. If we're using yellow light, we're going to use we use purple light or violet light, we're going to use a yellow filter. So there's certain filters that we'll use on the camera. And then other long exposure techniques that we'll use at a crime scene will be photographing, say, blue star or laser photography. So there's shooting reconstruction case, and you want to show that trajectory of the bullet with a laser. That's a long exposure. You're taking that photograph with. Or you have a crime scene that it's been cleaned up, and you're using blue star or luminol. And again, it's a long exposure to capture the chemiluminescence over time.
Right. And long exposure pretty much meaning keeping your shutter for a very long time.
Yeah, more than what you can handhold. More than a second is a long exposure. You can't really handle a second, so a second is a long exposure, or it could be minutes. So you're at a crime scene, it's in a pitch black, you're in the middle of a cornfield, and you have evidence in that field you want to show, but your flash is only going to go a certain distance. It's only going to go 40, 50, 60 feet, and then everything else is going to be pitch black around it. We could use a technique called painting with light, where we leave that shutter locked open by the bulb feature of the camera, leaving the shutter locked open for a long period of time, and then we put light where we want with the flash. So we'll pop the flash off at different intervals in different locations inside that scene to see the scene in its entirety.
Okay. Which is a very cool trick. I don't know if I should call it a trick. I'll call it a technique. That's not right to call it a trick. Very very cool technique. All right. Could you also talk about how I guess spatial relationships between objects can, I don't want to say make or break cases, but just talk about the importance of getting taking a good shot of I'm saying this so bad. How to just make sure that you're getting that this object is about X amount of feet from another object instead of making it look like it's a whole different amount of increments. I worded that poorly, but yeah.
So basically what you're trying to say is that you want to show the context of the evidence within the scene. Where is the relationship to the scene? Where is that knife related to the victim's hand? Where is that gun? And that's one of the most important things that you're doing is, not just showing what it looked like when you were there, but, where is this evidence? Where is it in relationship to the world around it? The spatial relationships of that evidence. And, depending on how you take that photograph, you can unintentionally create distortion, perspective distortion. So if you're at the wrong angle, if your camera's too low or too high, things could look bigger or smaller. If you have the wrong focal length dialed in, you can make things look bigger or smaller than they are, closer or further away to something else. So you could photograph, a knife that is a foot away from your victim's hand, but if you get a low angle and you use a a wide angle lens, you can make that knife look a lot further away. The same photograph, if you use a telephoto lens, you can make that knife appear almost on top of a person's hand. So we want to avoid that sort of perspective distortion when we're photographing evidence, we're photographing a crime scene. So there's certain types of lenses or focal lengths that we want to be at that's closest to the normal, the naked eye, which is called a normal lens. So typically, for a full frame censored camera, it's 50 millimeters. For a crop sensor, it's about 35 millimeters. And that's going to have less distortion than if you're at a wider angle, say like 18 millimeters, or if you're in a telephoto range, say 100 millimeters. How long is that lens? How short is that lens? Will change the way that evidence actually looks. You can make that knife look like it's a little knife like that, or you can make it look like it's a sword, depending on how you photograph it, because of distortion. And other than that, other lenses that we use will be a macro lens, and that's good for getting examination quality, close-up photography type shots. Sometimes you want to take a one-to-one image of something. That's how you would do it with a macro lens.
Okay. Makes sense.
So, do you see any connection, a little bit off topic, do you see any connection between like forensic photography and nowadays what we call like 3D crime scene reconstructions? Do they both work together, or it's completely like parallel, or?
Yeah, I think any sort of documentation does not replace another type of documentation. They all supplement each other. So, you could go to a crime scene, take great photographs, but if you don't have a report to back that up, to say all the other stuff that's not captured on photographs, then it's no good on its own. So like your photograph isn't capturing a smell that's inside the crime scene. Maybe it had a strong smell of bleach. Maybe that's something that's transient. Like you got there and there was like ice in the glass, and now that ice is melted. Your notes would capture that, whether the window is locked or not. Other things, lights are on or off. Your photographs may not capture all those details, but your notes and your reports could supplement that. So on the other end, your 2D diagrams give a great bird's eye view to the jury of the layout of your scene. And then now with 3D laser scanning and drone photography, drone videography, just other levels just to show that scene. I think it's all great, and it's just another way to show the jury that scene.
If you were given like a hypothetical scenario where you found a person who shot himself, probably shot himself, had the gun in his hand, or in his or her hand, and then the first responders came in and moved the gun. Now, you were briefed by the first responder that there was a gun in his or her hand. How would you take a photograph of that situation, knowing that you would show this photograph to a jury, saying that the person might or might not have used the gun, because the position as to how the gun was found initially would have changed. It also like determines if it was suicide or a murder. Like, how would you tackle a situation like this?
Yeah, I mean that happens a lot, unfortunately. And sometimes it happens because it has to happen.
Sure.
A situation like that, maybe for safety measures, the person will pick up the gun. The one thing you can never do is you can never put that evidence back. You can never put it, stage it in the person's hand. Oh, it kind of looks like this. It's picked up. It's moved. It's moved. That's it. You just document what you can. But what you can do, and I had a case where, again, learning from my mistakes. Years ago, it was a double murder in Brooklyn in a tire shop, and we document, collect all this evidence in the scene, a bunch of shell casings. There's 2 bodies. Hours later, we're leaving the scene, and a canine officer came up to me with a brown paper bag, and he's like, "Oh, here's that hat." I'm like, "What hat?" He's like, "Oh, this hat that they had me use to track the suspect for scent." So I'm like, "Okay, great." So I take down that person's information, I photograph the hat, I document it, send it off to the lab. DNA comes back to the suspect, person gets arrested, gets convicted, they go to jail. The case gets overturned because that officer that recovered that hat could never say where exactly they recovered it. Wasn't sure if it was in a street or on a sidewalk. So the evidence got thrown out, and then so did the case. So from that, learning from mistakes after that happened, every scene that I've been to where someone has removed something, I'm like, all right, show me exactly the area that you got it from. I'll take photographs of that area, and then I'll have them mark on my diagram, this is where I recovered it from. So that would never happen again. Fortunately, this guy probably did kill 2 people, and I don't know what happened to him afterwards, but he may be walking around free.
Yeah, see them a lot of technical questions, but I do want to know. It seems like it's a large crossover. Would you consider like I guess like photography? Is it more like scientific or more artistic? Because it seemed like you can't really have one without the other, I suppose.
That's a good point. Yeah. So photography is art and science. Knowing all the technical aspects of that exposure triangle, what those numbers are doing, the sensor itself, how that's working, the amount of megapixels your camera has, how big can I blow up that image, and then how you're taking that photograph. The artistic side of it is important. We don't really care so much that it's a beautiful photograph, though sometimes crime scene photographs can be put in a museum because they just happen to capture something that's interesting. But we really care more that, when I'm testifying to this image on a stand, that I can see everything, it's in focus, and that the jury knows what I'm doing. Is that, I'm doing it in a certain order, that when I photograph a scene, I have a game plan, that I'm going by that game plan. I'm not just like randomly taking photographs of things. I'm going to first start with all my overalls, then move on to my mid-range, my establishing photographs, and then my close-ups. So when I'm showing those photographs on the stand, I'm telling a story. This is the scene this is what it looked like when I got there. This is where the evidence was.
So I guess it's just a very different question that we ask in our field in forensics. It's not more of a beauty, it's more of information, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So I just one last question before we kind of wrap it up. Since you have so much knowledge and experience in the field of photography, and I know that you are a detective as well, would you have any suggestions or career advice for someone who wishes to advance their career in these fields as to how to? So it's sorry to extend it a little bit, but it's always so confusing when you like start a master's program in forensic as to which field to go in. And you're thrown with toxicology, DNA, crime scene, and photography. So what would your advice be for students who just kind of take up forensic as a career?
We just know that it's a huge field, that pretty much anything that you're interested in, there's like a counterpart for that. And find out where you're interested, focus on that, but know that it could change. I know plenty of people in the lab, usually they start you off in the drug section, and then they move you on from there. But it's a good thing is you understand the scientific method, you understand the processing that's done there, and then from there you could see what's going on around you, like, oh, it's interesting, question documents, or I'm interested in latent processing, and then move on to where you want. And just know that you could be going to school for one thing, and then you might wind up somewhere else. I know people even in the DNA lab that wind up doing something else. But the main thing is be passionate about it. Whether it's no matter what branch you're in, what subdivision you're in, got to be happy, because it's important work that we do, and ultimately you're talking about giving justice to somebody, or maybe putting somebody in prison for the rest of their life, and that's that's something that's really small, and that you should just think lightly about. So right. Be passionate about it. If you're not passionate about it, find something that you're passionate about. That's the most important thing, and know that if you don't have restrictions on where you want to live, there is tons of work out there. The hardest thing is getting your first job, especially in the lab. Once you get that first job, it's easy to find another job. They say it's easy to find a job when you have a job. That's so true with this field. Once they get over that hurdle of finding your first job, that's the first thing. And a way to get over that is, when you're in school, intern. get to know people, intern at your local, labs or police department or whatever it is you want to do, because typically that's who they're, like they know you, like, oh, this is a person that they're a hard worker, they're interesting, they're cool to hang out with. We have an opening, we want that person. Then some stranger that they don't know, they just see their CV. So interning, not only are you getting to know the people, but you're getting experience. And that's one thing. You can go to university, you can study under, any professor, brilliant or not. But in the end, it's your experience that's going to be your most powerful tool. You have to know all of the academic part of it, and that's important. But applying those academics in the field, that's how you really hone your craft.
Thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful piece of advice.
Yes.
So thank you so much. It was such an informative episode. I think I learned a lot than I learned in the past few years about photography. I think I just concentrated DNA and forgot about the rest. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Definitely.
I let Julian wrap it up.
Yeah, we appreciate you coming. Whenever you're ready to teach us over here in Boston, the crime scene photography part 2.
Yeah,
with Nitty,
I'm hoping to come back.
We look forward to it. Everyone says hi because I told them, I'll be with you, I guess. So hey, the whole lab says what's up.
Cubicle for me.
All right, so I'm happy, man. I think we got it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was
guys.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Be safe.
Bye.
All right. Thanks again.